It was a typical busy afternoon at the airport. Rachel Williams, a quiet but confident black woman in her early 30s, was about to board her flight from New York to Los Angeles. She had just wrapped up a week-long business trip and was looking forward to a little rest and relaxation. Rachel was dressed in a sharp business suit, her hair neatly pulled back, and her designer luggage matched her sophisticated style. As she walked through the terminal, she passed several other passengers, some rushing, some standing in long lines, and others just waiting for their flight to begin. Rachel was no stranger to travel. She had worked in corporate for several years, and her job required her to hop on flights frequently. But this time, it was different. Today, she wasn't just a regular business traveler. She was one of the airline's investors. Rachel had invested a significant amount in the airline some years ago, and she had become one of the company's major shareholders. As a result, she was often treated with extra care whenever she flew with them. It wasn't something she flaunted. In fact, she preferred to keep it low-key. She just wanted to be like any other passenger and enjoy her flight. As Rachel approached the gate, she quickly checked in, and then she made her way to the business class boarding line. She had a first-class seat waiting for her, something she earned from her years of flying and investing in the airline. It wasn't just about luxury, though. It was about the comfort and the space she needed after a long week of meetings and stress. The flight was going to be just under 6 hours, and she needed to be well rested for the week ahead. Once she boarded the plane, Rachel walked through the narrow aisle to her seat in business class. She took a deep breath, settling into her seat by the window. The spacious cabin gave her plenty of room to stretch out and relax. She closed her eyes for a moment, mentally preparing herself for the flight. She smiled to herself, thinking about the peaceful time she would have during the flight, free from work emails and endless phone calls. But things quickly took an unexpected turn. As Rachel adjusted her seatbelt and placed her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was a flight attendant, a young woman with a bright smile and a neat uniform. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant began, her tone polite but firm. "I'm afraid you'll need to move to economy class. We're having some seating issues in business, and we need to accommodate other passengers." Rachel looked up, confused. "I'm sorry, but I think my seat is correct. I'm in business class," she explained calmly. The flight attendant, not knowing who Rachel was, insisted, "I understand, but we're having some issues. Could you please move?" The attendant's voice was gentle but unyielding. Rachel paused, taken aback by the request. She didn't expect this kind of treatment, especially in business class. Something felt off, but she didn't argue. Instead, she asked the attendant, "Could you please check the seating again?" The flight attendant didn't immediately respond, and Rachel could tell the situation was starting to become uncomfortable. Rachel glanced around and noticed other passengers beginning to watch the interaction. Her instincts told her that something unusual was happening, but she couldn't put her finger on it just yet. This wasn't how a business class passenger was supposed to be treated. Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach, unsure of what would happen next. The flight attendant stood in front of Rachel, still smiling, but her eyes had a more serious look now. "I'm really sorry for the confusion, ma'am. It seems that there's an issue with the seating arrangement," the attendant said again, trying to sound polite. "There are a few other passengers who need to be moved up, and unfortunately, we need to make some space here in business class." Rachel was still puzzled. She hadn't heard of any changes or seat assignments being wrong. In fact, she had received confirmation of her seat earlier in the day when she checked in online. Her flight ticket clearly showed her seat in business class. She couldn't understand why she was being asked to move, especially when there was plenty of space in the cabin. "I'm not sure why this is happening," Rachel said calmly, looking the flight attendant directly in the eyes. "I've checked my ticket. My seat is right here, in business class. I don't think I should move." The flight attendant paused for a moment, looking at the boarding pass Rachel was holding, before replying, "I completely understand. But please trust me, We're just trying to make sure everything works out for all passengers. We're a bit behind on boarding, and things are a little crowded. I'm asking for your cooperation so everyone is comfortable." Rachel couldn't believe it. She had seen other passengers board without any problems, and there were empty seats still visible in business class. Yet the flight attendant seemed to be asking her to leave this comfortable seat for no good reason. "Please, I just want to make sure you're in the right place," the flight attendant added, her voice now carrying a slight hint of insistence. "I'll be happy to help you get settled in economy class, where there are still some open seats." Rachel felt a wave of frustration rising. She wasn't one to make a scene or argue, but something about this situation didn't sit right with her. She took a moment to collect her thoughts. Why was the flight attendant treating her this way? Was it possible that she was just making a simple mistake? Or was there something more behind it? As Rachel calmly tried to explain that her seat was correct, she began to notice a few things. The flight attendant seemed unusually focused on her, as if Rachel was the only one being asked to move. She glanced around the cabin, seeing that other passengers were being allowed to settle into their seats without issue. She began to wonder if this was simply a misunderstanding, or if the flight attendant had made an assumption about her based on her appearance. Maybe she thought Rachel didn't belong in business class. After all, Rachel was black, and she knew how easy it was for people to make snap judgments based on race. But Rachel pushed the thought aside, trying not to let her emotions take over. "Can you double-check with your supervisor?" Rachel asked, her voice polite but firm. "I don't think there's any reason for me to move." The flight attendant hesitated, a look of uncertainty crossing her face. She wasn't used to passengers refusing to follow her instructions, especially in such a calm manner. After a brief pause, the attendant nodded and walked away, still holding Rachel's boarding pass. As she disappeared into the galley to consult with her supervisor, Rachel leaned back in her seat, taking a deep breath. Other passengers in business class were still watching, some exchanging curious glances. Rachel could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't care. She just wanted to get to her destination in peace. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She was about to learn something that would change everything. "You said." Rachel sat back in her seat, trying to stay calm as she waited for the flight attendant to return. Her mind raced with thoughts. Was this all just a simple mistake? Maybe the airline was just having some sort of seating problem. But the more she thought about it, the more she wondered why she, of all passengers, was being asked to move. She glanced around at the other people in business class. Some were reading books, others chatting quietly, and a few were looking out the windows, lost in their own thoughts. Everyone seemed to be at ease, unaware of what was happening at the front of the cabin. The sound of the flight attendants' voices echoed from the galley, but Rachel couldn't make out the words. She was too far away, and it wasn't like she could overhear anything useful. The minutes ticked by slowly, and Rachel's patience started to wear thin. She didn't want to cause any trouble, but she knew that she couldn't just let herself be pushed around either. After all, she had paid for her seat in business class, and everything about her boarding pass said that she belonged here. A few moments later, the flight attendant returned, her face slightly redder than before, likely from speaking with her supervisor. She approached Rachel again, but this time there was a more apologetic tone in her voice. "Ma'am," she began, "I've spoken with my supervisor, and it seems there's been some confusion on our part. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. I thought you were in the wrong seat, but now I see everything is fine. Please accept my apologies for the misunderstanding." Rachel took a deep breath. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, but she quickly pushed it down. She didn't want to make a scene, and part of her understood that the flight attendant was just doing her job. Still, it didn't change the fact that Rachel was asked to leave her seat in the first place. "I appreciate the apology," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I'm not sure why I was the only one asked to move. Everyone else in business class is settled. Why me?" The flight attendant seemed caught off guard by the question. She opened her mouth to speak, but then hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I really don't know, she stammered. I thought maybe there was a mistake with your seating, but it turns out everything is in order. Rachel could feel the tension in the air, and she wasn't sure whether it was just her imagination or if everyone around her was noticing what was happening. A couple of passengers from the back of the cabin were staring in their direction, clearly curious about the exchange. The flight attendant, trying to smooth things over, smiled weakly. Again, I'm truly sorry. It wasn't my intention to make you feel uncomfortable. If you'd like, I can get you anything to drink or help you settle in better. Rachel nodded, her mind still processing what had just happened. She didn't feel completely at ease, but she didn't want to escalate the situation further. The flight attendant quickly moved on to the next task, and Rachel was left in her seat, still unsure of what had just unfolded. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for takeoff, Rachel couldn't help but wonder, was this a mistake, or had something else been at play here? She decided to wait and see what would happen next. Little did she know, the next turn of events would reveal the surprising truth. The plane's engines hummed as it slowly began its taxi to the runway, and Rachel could finally relax. The tension from the earlier exchange with the flight attendant had started to ease. She glanced out of the window, watching the airport slowly fade into the distance as the plane ascended into the sky. But the incident wasn't something she could easily shake off. The uncomfortable feeling lingered in the back of her mind. As the flight attendants moved down the aisle, handing out drinks and snacks, Rachel tried to put the incident behind her. She was now focused on her upcoming week, needing to prepare for meetings and business calls once she landed in Los Angeles. But as she reached for a magazine in the seat pocket, she heard a voice from across the aisle. "Excuse me," said a man seated in business class, looking at the flight attendant with a raised eyebrow. "Is there a reason why you asked that woman to move?" The flight attendant, who had been walking down the aisle, paused and turned to him, her expression a bit surprised by the question. "Oh, it was just a mix-up with the seating arrangements," she explained, trying to sound calm. "We're just trying to make sure everyone is comfortable." The man didn't seem convinced. "She clearly belongs in that seat," he said, his voice firm. "I saw her boarding and everything seemed fine. Why did you ask her to move?" The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably but remained polite. "We're just following procedures," she responded, though her voice lacked the usual confidence. Rachel, who had been trying to ignore the conversation, now sat up straighter. She couldn't help but overhear the exchange. More passengers had started to notice what had happened earlier, and whispers spread through the cabin. A woman seated a few rows behind Rachel leaned forward, catching the flight attendant's attention. "I don't mean to interfere, but I was watching everything. You asked her to move for no reason, didn't you? I don't think that was fair." The flight attendant quickly glanced at Rachel, who was now looking back at her with a mixture of confusion and frustration. She gave a nervous smile but didn't respond right away. The passengers who had spoken up seemed to be supporting Rachel, and this made her feel slightly better. She hadn't imagined the situation. Others had noticed it too. The man who had first spoken up continued, "It's a shame that this is happening. She should be treated the same way as everyone else. No one should have to justify why they're in business class." Rachel felt a rush of gratitude toward the passengers who were defending her. She had never been one to seek attention or make a scene, but it was clear now that the treatment she'd received wasn't just a simple mistake. There was something more to it. But instead of feeling angry, Rachel felt empowered by the support from those around her. The flight attendant, realizing that she had drawn attention to herself, apologized again. "I'm really sorry for the confusion," she said, though her words now seemed less genuine. "We'll make sure everything is taken care of moving forward." Rachel smiled politely but didn't say anything more. She had no desire to argue further. As the flight settled into its smooth course, the interaction left her thinking more deeply. Why had the flight attendant acted in such a way? Was it just a misunderstanding, or was there something more personal behind it? The rest of the passengers seemed to go back to their routines, but the whispers continued. Rachel couldn't help but wonder if the flight attendant realized that her actions had affected more than just one passenger. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but something inside her told her that this wasn't over yet. As the flight continued, Rachel settled back in her seat, trying to focus on the in-flight entertainment screen in front of her. But her mind kept wandering back to the earlier incident. The uncomfortable feeling didn't seem to go away. Despite the flight attendant's apology and the passenger's support, Rachel couldn't shake the nagging thought that something had happened that shouldn't have. The moment the flight reached its cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was turned off, the flight attendants began their usual rounds, offering drinks and snacks. Rachel declined, not feeling very hungry. She watched them go up and down the aisles, attending to the passengers. She could see the flight attendant from earlier, now walking with her head down, trying her best to avoid eye contact with Rachel. Just then, a man from across the aisle, who had been one of the passengers to speak up in her defense earlier, leaned over toward her. He had been glancing at her every now and then, and finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. "Excuse me," he said, speaking quietly but with a curious tone. "I don't mean to intrude, but I heard that the flight attendant asked you to move to economy class. Is that right?" Rachel nodded, surprised by the man's interest in the situation. "Yes, that's correct. I don't know why she did it, though. My seat was confirmed in business class." The man raised an eyebrow, glancing over at the flight attendant, who was now speaking to a few rows ahead. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I overheard something interesting. The flight attendant didn't just make a mistake. She didn't know who you were." Rachel frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated for a moment, then leaned closer. "I heard her talking to another staff member after she asked you to move. She mentioned something about how you didn't look like you were supposed to be in business class. It was like she thought you were just a regular passenger." He paused before adding, "But I don't think she realized who you are." Rachel felt a sudden jolt. Was it possible that the flight attendant had assumed she didn't belong in business class simply because of her appearance? The thought made her uneasy, but it also sparked something inside her. It made sense. The way the attendant had acted, her insistence that Rachel move, it didn't seem like a mistake, but rather an assumption. The man continued, sensing Rachel's growing realization. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it seems like she might have been treating you differently because of how you look. It's hard to ignore that sometimes." Rachel's stomach tightened. She had been trying to dismiss that very idea. But now, hearing it out loud, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Was it possible that the flight attendant had judged her based on her race? Was it that simple? The man gave her a sympathetic look. "I'm really sorry this happened to you. It wasn't right. I hope they take this seriously." Rachel nodded slowly, absorbing what he had just said. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was beginning to see the truth behind the incident. It wasn't just a random mistake. It was something more, something deeply rooted in assumptions. As the flight went on, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about it. She felt a mix of frustration and determination building inside her. Something needed to change, not just for her, but for everyone who might face the same situation in the future. She wasn't sure how, but she knew this wasn't over. And it wouldn't be the last time she would stand up for what was right. As the flight continued smoothly through the skies, Rachel couldn't shake the thoughts swirling in her mind. The conversation with the man across the aisle kept replaying over and over in her head. The flight attendant's behavior had started to make sense, but that only made Rachel feel more unsettled. If the attendant had assumed that Rachel didn't belong in business class because of how she looked, then the situation was more than just a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of something much deeper. Rachel wasn't used to confronting issues like this. In her professional life, she had always tried to stay focused on her work and avoid unnecessary drama. But this felt different. It wasn't just about her. It was about a system that had treated her unfairly based on her appearance, a system that had made an assumption without knowing who she really was. As she sat quietly in her seat, Rachel glanced around the cabin. The flight attendants were still moving up and down the aisle, attending to passengers with smiles on their faces. But Rachel couldn't look at them the same way anymore. The earlier exchange had left a mark on her, and now the whole situation seemed tinted with the uncomfortable feeling of being judged before she was even given a chance. The flight attendants seemed to be oblivious to what had really happened. They were busy handing out drinks, offering snacks, and making small talk with passengers. But the deeper issue was still there, hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. Rachel felt a sense of embarrassment creeping in, not because of anything she had done, but because of the way the situation had unfolded. It was as though the flight attendant had felt the need to question Rachel's place in business class, something she had earned through years of hard work, both professionally and as an investor in the airline. Rachel had invested her time and money into the company, trusting that it would treat all its passengers equally. Now she felt as if she had been reduced to nothing more than an assumption based on appearance. But as the plane continued its journey, Rachel's embarrassment slowly began to turn into something else: determination. She knew that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was something that could happen again to anyone, anywhere. And if she didn't speak up now, who would? Rachel turned her attention to the window, looking out at the clouds below. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she didn't have to let this moment define her. She had worked too hard to let an unfortunate experience ruin her day, and she knew that her position as an investor in the airline gave her a unique opportunity to address the issue. The flight attendants were still busy serving the rest of the passengers, but Rachel had made up her mind. She was going to take action. The experience wasn't just something she could forget. It was something that needed to be addressed, both for her own peace of mind and for the sake of future passengers who might find themselves in a similar situation. Rachel pulled out her phone, composing an email to the airline's customer service department. She wanted to make sure that what had happened was properly understood and addressed. She wanted to make sure that no one else would have to experience what she had just gone through. As she typed the email, she felt a sense of control returning. The experience wasn't over, but now she had a plan, and that made all the difference. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but Rachel couldn't help but feel uneasy. She kept her thoughts to herself, focusing on the in-flight entertainment or reading a book, trying to distract herself from the feelings that had started to surface. But deep down, she knew that things weren't quite right. The discomfort from earlier in the flight lingered. As the plane descended toward Los Angeles, Rachel could see the sprawling city below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the sky. She was eager to get off the plane and start her week, but she couldn't help but wonder if the situation she had experienced earlier would follow her. Just as the plane began its final approach, a soft chime rang through the cabin, signaling that the flight attendants were preparing for landing. Rachel fastened her seatbelt and looked around the cabin. Some passengers were already gathering their belongings, while others settled in for the last few moments of the flight. Rachel's mind was still focused on the issue with the flight attendant, and she couldn't help but feel that the apology she had received earlier wasn't enough. When the plane finally touched down and the seatbelt sign turned off, Rachel stood up and began to collect her things. As she reached for her bag, she noticed the same flight attendant who had asked her to move earlier walking toward her with an apologetic look on her face. "Ms. Williams," the flight attendant said, her voice hesitant. Rachel turned to face her. "I just wanted to apologize again for what happened earlier. I spoke with my supervisor, and we understand now that everything was in order with your seat. It was a misunderstanding on my part, and I truly regret how it was handled." Rachel gave a polite but tight smile, her emotions still mixed. "Thank you for the apology," she said, her voice calm. "But I think it's important to recognize that this situation wasn't just about a mistake. It's about how assumptions can affect the way people are treated." The flight attendant nodded, clearly embarrassed. "I understand, and I'm truly sorry for what you experienced. It wasn't my intention to make you uncomfortable. I know now that I should have handled it differently." Rachel paused for a moment, her mind racing. She could tell the flight attendant genuinely felt bad, but that didn't change what had happened. The incident had opened her eyes to how easily people could be judged based on their appearance, and she knew this wasn't something that could just be brushed aside with an apology. "I appreciate your apology," Rachel said, her tone more serious now. "But this goes beyond just me. It's about making sure no one else has to experience this kind of treatment. If you really want to make things right, I'd suggest that the airline take steps to address these kinds of assumptions and biases." The flight attendant looked down, clearly uncomfortable, but nodding. "I agree. We'll definitely look into it. Thank you for your understanding." As the flight attendant walked away, Rachel's thoughts continued to race. It wasn't enough to just apologize. Something needed to change. She had worked hard to get to where she was, both in her career and as an investor in the airline, and she wasn't about to let one bad experience go unnoticed. Rachel made a mental note to follow up with the airline's customer service again once she was on the ground. It was clear that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a sign of a bigger problem that needed to be addressed at a higher level. As the plane doors opened, Rachel felt a sense of resolution. The incident might not be over, but she was determined to make sure it didn't happen again. As Rachel stepped off the plane and walked through the busy terminal, her thoughts were still focused on what had happened during the flight. The airport was bustling with people, some rushing to catch their next flights, others waiting for loved ones. The sound of rolling luggage and distant announcements filled the air, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she had just gone through something important. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her as she walked, though it wasn't as if anyone was directly staring. It was more like the weight of their thoughts was pressing on her, and for a moment, she wondered if she should just forget about it. After all, she had already received an apology from the flight attendant. But deep down, Rachel knew that this wasn't something she could just move on from. It was bigger than just that one uncomfortable encounter. It was about something that happened every day to many people, not just her. The more Rachel thought about the experience, the more she realized that it wasn't just about being treated unfairly because of her appearance. It was about the assumptions people make when they don't know someone's story. The flight attendant had treated her as though she didn't belong in business class, despite all the signs that said she did. And when she had been forced to justify her place, it had made Rachel question how many other times in her life she had been overlooked or underestimated because of how she looked. As Rachel walked to the baggage claim, she took a moment to think about her role in the airline. She wasn't just a passenger. She had invested time and money into the company, and that gave her a platform to make a difference. But Rachel wasn't sure how to approach the issue. She wasn't the type to make a scene, but now that she had experienced it firsthand, she knew she had to take action. When Rachel arrived at the baggage claim area, she stopped for a moment, waiting for her luggage to arrive on the carousel. She could feel her heart racing as she considered what to do next. Should she speak to the airline directly, or was there a better way to make sure this didn't happen again? Then it hit her. Maybe it wasn't just about fixing the problem on one flight. Maybe it was about helping the airline, and others like it, recognize the impact of bias and assumptions. Rachel had the ability to bring about real change, not just for herself, but for everyone who might find themselves in the same situation. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. As she finally grabbed her suitcase from the carousel, Rachel's mind was made up. She would reach out to the airline's higher-ups, not with anger, but with a proposal. A proposal to change the way things were done, to address unconscious biases, and to make sure that every passenger was treated with respect, no matter what they looked like. This wasn't just about her. It was about fairness, equality, and dignity for everyone. Rachel knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation, but it was one that needed to be had. And in that moment, as she walked toward the airport exit, she felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't going to let this go. She would use her voice and her position to make sure that this wasn't just another forgotten incident. It would be the first step toward real change. Rachel's plane had landed, and she had arrived in Los Angeles, but the journey didn't feel over. As she left the airport and made her way to her hotel. Her thoughts were still occupied by what had happened. The situation had made her realize something important. It wasn't enough to just accept what had happened and move on. She had the power to make sure it didn't happen again, not just for herself, but for others as well. And that was something worth fighting for. Rachel took a few days to settle into her routine in Los Angeles. She attended her meetings, caught up on emails, and handled the tasks that needed her attention. But in the evenings, she spent her time drafting a letter to the airline. She carefully explained the events of the flight, the misunderstanding, and the way she had been treated. She was calm, yet firm in her words, knowing that the issue was more than just a simple mistake. It was about how assumptions could affect people's experiences, and she wanted to make sure the airline understood that. In her letter, Rachel didn't just point out the problem. She suggested solutions. She recommended that the airline implement training on unconscious bias for all employees, especially flight attendants. She wanted them to learn how to treat each passenger with respect, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. The airline, she wrote, should not only apologize for what happened, but take real steps to prevent future misunderstandings. A few days after sending her letter, Rachel received a response from the airline CEO. The message was professional and sincere, apologizing once again for the incident. But more importantly, it mentioned that the airline had already started to look into the issue. They acknowledged that the experience Rachel had gone through was unacceptable, and they were committed to making changes. The CEO assured Rachel that they would begin diversity and inclusion training for all employees and review their internal policies to ensure that all passengers, regardless of appearance, would be treated with fairness and respect. Rachel was pleased by the response, but she knew that real change didn't happen overnight. She wasn't expecting an immediate transformation, but she had taken the first step. By using her voice and position, she had made the airline recognize the issue. And that was something she could be proud of. Weeks later, Rachel attended a meeting with other investors and executives from the airline. The topic of diversity and inclusion came up, and the CEO mentioned the changes that were underway. It felt good to know that her efforts were part of a larger movement within the company. She wasn't just an investor anymore. She was a part of something bigger, a movement that sought to improve the airline's culture for everyone. As Rachel looked back on the flight, she realized that it had been a turning point. What started as an uncomfortable experience had led her to stand up for what was right. She had taken action not just for herself, but for all passengers who might face bias in the future. The experience had shown her that one person could make a difference. Rachel felt proud of what she had accomplished. She knew there was still work to be done, but she had taken the first step. And as she looked out the window of the meeting room, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Change had begun, and she had helped lead it.